Right, so welcome everyone to Straight Science. This is an evening science presentation series put on by UAF, Northwest Campus in Nome, and UAF Alaska Sea Grant, also in Nome, and you're in the home office. We're really excited for tonight's speaker. Oh, before I forget, for those of you who may not be familiar with Zoom, at the bottom of the screen, I don't think Jason's going to mind if you have questions that you want to shout out, although a lot of people wait till the end. At the bottom of the screen, there is like a little cartoon bubble, and it says chat. And people can type in. If you click on that, you can get a little text, and you can type in or text in whatever your question or message or comment may be. And if you don't feel comfortable speaking. So I just wanted to point that out. So use that chat feature. I'll be monitoring it. And I do know we have a couple of callers calling in. So really great. And we're really looking forward to hearing from Jason Miszaniec. He is a postdoc research associate and museum scientist at the University of Wisconsin Madison. For those who are joining back in, this talk came out of John Darwin's earlier talk in June. That was really interesting about Eastern Norton Sound, and for someone like myself who is a transplant to the region, hearing about the magnificent communities throughout Eastern Norton Sound, they were huge. They're talking about 2,000 years ago. You know, some of the largest coastal settlements anywhere, where you had, like Jason was saying, 175 housing depressions. I mean, 175 families living in a community, just massive and terribly important. So with that, what Jason's going to talk about tonight is the stories the bones tell. He is a specialist. He's been looking at a part of the archaeological project with Shaktoolik that is in partnership with the Shaktoolik Native Corporation. And Jason's going to talk about several research techniques that tell the past stories of the subsistence economies and fisheries. So we're going to hear how people adapted to the environment here and what can be learned about past and current climate events. And I think we're all pretty ears up on that. So with that, Jason, welcome to Straight Science, and welcome, thank you all of the audience for attending, and take it away, Jason.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Gabe, for inviting me, and thank you all for zooming in this evening. I did most of my kind of dissertation work in California, so it is so refreshing to have people who kind of live in Alaska, kind of live in the area, to kind of share this research with, but also to get your insight from. So as Gay hinted, this presentation will be on the zooarchaeology of Norton Sound. Oh. And this is part of the wider Shaktoolik Archaeology Project. So it's centered in Norton Sound, Alaska, which is a shallow body inlet from the North Bering Sea. That kind of blurb I always say for those from the lower 48. But it is this interesting area because it's both this cultural and environmental transitionary zone. It really marks this transition between the more boreal, kind of warmer Pacific ocean waters and the cooler Arctic waters. So you get this nice blend of Pacific and Arctic fauna in the area. So it's an interesting place in terms of climate change because it's often kind of seen as this canary in the coal mine, of where this is where it may happen kind of first and kind of early signs. And when we kind of look at past climate change, we can look at how people living in this area may have adapted to past trends of climate change. So this is part of the Shaktoolik Archaeology Project, which is a larger project that is a collaboration between the UC Davis archaeologists and the native village of Shaktoolik and the Shaktoolik Native Corporation. It started in earnest in 2013. In 2014, I joined to do my dissertation, and which I defended in 2020. So a lot of my talk today will be focused on my dissertation research, but we'll also touch upon hopefully my current work, and I'll hint at some kind of future project directions that will be kind of headed in the area. So the overall goal of the Shaktoolik Archaeology Project is to look at long-term ecological interactions between people and the environment over a 4,500-year period in the region. And this kind of our research objectives and kind of what we're investigating is largely influenced by community members whose kind of biggest concerns are: how did past people adapt to climate change? How did past animal communities react to climate change events? And kind of the big thing, what can the past tell us about the future? So this is very much kind of like a sequel to John Darwin's talk that he gave in June. So for kind of part one, I suggest, if you haven't seen this, just you all kind of check that out later. Very cool stuff, and John's a great presenter, so please check it out. While John's talk was more about the archaeology and kind of settlements and kind of getting more into the sites of the area, I'm going to focus more on the environment and subsistence and people's interactions with animal communities. So why these old bones? Why does it matter? And who looks at this? So I'm an archaeologist, but within archaeology, there's a subdiscipline of zooarchaeology, and that's what I am. I'm a zooarchaeologist. And zooarchaeology is the study of animal remains from archaeological contexts. So this is not to be confused with paleontology, which is something that you might look at dinosaurs or past mammoths. This is really looking at the relationship between humans and animals. And there's two big focuses in zooarchaeology, and it is to reconstruct subsistence strategies and the environments of these past peoples. So people have been hunting in Eastern Norton Sound and fishing for 4,000 years. And the animal remains that they've accumulated at their sites represent a wealth of cultural and environmental knowledge. And you could really kind of compare that to current wildlife biologists or fisheries biologists who go out and collect animals and to get a kind of a survey of the area. That's exactly what kind of subsistence hunters were doing in the past. And we can use these rich data sets to learn about these past environments. So this is kind of a broad model of what the general kind of view of coastal Alaskan subsistence strategies were for the past kind of 4,000 years. And these are kind of general assumptions made off of indirect lines of evidence like artifacts and harpoon heads. And it's couched in this tripartite system. So you have caribou, marine mammals, and then this very kind of vague group of just fish. And usually it refers to salmon. So in Norton Sound, the first coastal human occupation that we have records of is of the Denby Flint complex. And this is this semi-sedentary nomadic group thought to be a mixed terrestrial and marine environment kind of coming in the area. And recent work by Andy Tremaine shows that it might be kind of been more maritime focused. And then we get a gap. And the next group to enter the area that appears in the area is the Norton Culture. And this is very much an explosion of maritime adaptations. So while the Denby Flint complex were kind of this dual economy, the Nortons seem to have been going all in maritime resources with some terrestrial on the side. But kind of previous models have been focused on marine mammals and chiefly salmon. And once again, this is based off of a lot of kind of artifact evidence. So then there was another gap in the area, and kind of more on the gaps, I suggest that you check out John's talk. He kind of talks more about kind of the archaeological gaps and kind of what we're doing to investigate these. And whether this is a true gap or an archaeological gap or a lack of sampling is still up in the air. So the next kind of block of groups that we get in the area are the Nucleate, which is an archaeologically recognized group. They are a branch of another archaeological group called the Western Thule. And then around, and this time period is characterized as largely focused on marine mammal hunting, harp seals, bearded seals, as well as whale. And then around 1400, 1500 years AD, we get an explosion in fishing artifacts. So a lot of net spacers, net shuttles, different types of hook and line, and this is interpreted as a explosion of reliance on fish. And once again, fish is very vague. And with the entrance of early Euro-American traders, we then see populations collapse in Norton Sound, and historical Inupiaq people arrive from the north and largely kind of inhabit the Shaktoolik region today. So kind of past this tripartite system, there's a lot that it seems to be lacking. Looking at the ethnographic and historic and kind of just contemporary subsistence hunters, it's lacking a lot of nuance of the local ecology. Past just being fish, bird, fish, caribou, and seal, we see huge variability of multitude of different fish, several bird species, caribou, a lot of fur-bearing animals, a lot of different marine mammals, and something that I'm going to touch a little bit today, plants as well. So looking at those non-artifact materials from archaeological collections, such as animal bones and seeds, can really fill out these pictures of the past lifeways and environments that people are living in the past. So this work is done in conjunction with the native village of Shaktoolik. Here's a nice little kind of just a kind of picture of our collaborators and kind of past researchers and the current researchers who work in the area. So we took kind of local interns. We have sometimes visits of from local archaeologists to do school visits. And here's kind of a few researchers that some of you may recognize. So we have Chris and John, who are joining us today as well in the Zoom, as well as Andy Tremaine, who was one of Chris's old students and used to be with Park Service, and Kelly Eldridge, who's now working with the Engineering Corps. And so community is very much involved, and it's just great to kind of work with the young people from the community. It's a pleasure. So here is a satellite image of kind of the Shaktoolik region, as we call it. And we see there's Cape Denby, and then the village of Shaktoolik is on this peninsula. So there's kind of two broad archaeological regions that we're working with. The first is Cape Denby. This is where some of the oldest coastal inhabitation in all of Alaska is found, dating back to around 4,000 years ago. And it is this rocky cape kind of jutting in to the ocean. And the second area that I'll be talking about today, and I'll spend kind of more time there because that's where kind of most of our kind of recent work was on, is the Shaktoolik Peninsula. And it's this rich estuary system, has ideal location of having the rivers on one side and then the Bering Sea on the other. So like best of both worlds. And oldest occupation goes back around 2,500 years ago, and occupation continued just up to the present. And this is kind of a nicer image of that peninsula. And the two sites that I'll be focusing on today are Difjahuk and the Shaktoolik airport site. We did work on this kind of site that we excavated in 2019. Unfortunately, there's not too many animal bones from that site, so I'm not going to be talking about that in this presentation. So just kind of a recap. This is our timeline, and kind of the earliest groups recorded so far in the Shaktoolik Peninsula are the Norton, and this is recorded from both Difjahuk and the First Bend site. And then at the Shaktoolik airport site, we can get this like second movements of people in the area with the Nucleate people, then ethnographically recognized and current kind of really recognized Yupik speakers and Inupiaq people. And I just want to kind of quickly talk about the climatic context. Obviously, climate change is a big thing happening now, and it happened in the past. And I think it's important to talk about that even though climatic events happened in the past where things are colder and warmer, they didn't match just the rapid scale of change that we're seeing today. So generally in the Holocene epoch, which we're kind of taking place in, around the middle Holocene, like 6,000, 5,000 years ago, things are actually were warmer. And when we see kind of some of the first inhabitants of the sound, it marks this decrease in temperatures called a neoglacial, but it's a little bit of a misnomer because temperatures in the neoglacial were actually still kind of warm in average compared to today. And the two charts you're looking at is a mean temperature reconstruction from Greenlandic ice cores, and then sea ice reconstruction from moraine diatoms from the Chukchi Sea. And in this case, you have kind of for the top chart, you have the dotted line. Anything above that is warm, anything below that is cool. And then for that kind of blue line graph, anything below that line is kind of less sea extent than present, and then anything above that is more than kind of current day. So temperatures then peaked around 1000 CE or AD, which is noted as the MCA. And this is when the Thule and Nucleate people enter the area. And then they start to decrease during kind of 1500 AD, what is known as the Little Ice Age. So we have this very impressive record in Eastern Norton Sound. Each shaded area represents where we have faunal remains for. So we can get this, maybe not a complete time series, but snapshots of kind of past environments from these midden deposits. So talking a little bit about how we collect both faunal and botanic remains, because this is key. All good data collection starts here. So we excavate things both with 1/4-inch screens. So each time we dig something out of the soil, we then screen it. You can see John both on a good day and John on a bad day screening some dirt. But screens are good. They're good for big excavations and moving a lot of soil. But if you want to get kind of the full picture, get the plants, get those fish, get shellfish, you need to take soil samples. So we take these column samples in kind of these midden deposits, and we just bring all the dirt back to our lab and wash that dirt. And the goal is to get all the tiny little fish bones and seeds in that. So it gives you a very high resolution picture of past environments and past diets. And then we bring these materials to the lab to identify. For the sediment samples, we laboriously go through them and pick the bone from the rock, from the wood, from the insect, from the seeds. It takes a lot of time, and a lot of good podcasts I listen to while doing it, and definitely an army of interns help. So I'm going to pivot a little bit and now focus on kind of 3 kind of main points I'd like to then kind of spend the rest of the talk about. I'm going to first talk about the Norton subsistence economies. So kind of those some of the first kind of big, large scale kind of populations in the Shaktoolik area. I'll then move to that kind of second wave of people in the around 1000 to kind of the historic era. And then I'm going to end the presentation talking about what can this tell us about kind of past ecology and current climate change. So if any of you flown from Nucleate to Shaktoolik, you would have flown above this site. So this is Difchuk. And this is, I think, a shot that John took, John Darwin. And right here are these house depressions. So a massive site, 150 houses. And you can actually see this from space. You can see it from Google Earth. So this period on 500 BCE to 2,500 years ago marks the fluorescence of the Norton Culture and the Norton Sound. And this is a period marked by large coastal settlements, large houses. This is ones around 5 meters in diameter and 1 meter to 1.5 meters deep. Some are deeper than that, if you can believe it. And we see a bunch of new technologies appear this time. We see net sinkers, we see ceramics. Everything is suggesting that people are moving towards the coast and relying more on marine and riverine resources. And it's important to note this is not the only settlement of this size. Cape Nome has a very large one as well. And there's another large one by the Nucleate airport as well. So something's happening around this time where there's a lot of people in the Sound. So past caribou, seal, and fish. What are people eating? What are sustaining these large villages? In 2016, John and I went up to try to find midden deposits, try to get some kind of those faunal remains, some animal bones. And we were so lucky to actually find a shell midden in the berm of one of these houses. So shell is great in areas that are well drained because typically these areas don't preserve well, but the alkaline nature of shells counteract acidic soils. So you get a lot of organic remains that would otherwise not preserve in these settings. So this is a shot of the shell bin. You see all that kind of, this is all blue mussel. You see all this eroding out. And here's a profile with it because it's this little mound. Just some shots showing the excellent preservation. So there are some artifacts, we understand pottery, and that's very cool. It tells us a lot about what people were doing. You can look at residues, but I'm in it here. I'm in it for the bones. Look at all these interesting kind of faunal remains. We have fox, we have bearded seal, and we also have signs of not just subsistence animals, but maybe secondary products. So an antler tine here from caribou, and we have a walrus skull here. And if you kind of know your walrus skulls, you can see that this one has alveolar bone smashed for ivory extraction. So very cool stuff. But what are people eating? Kind of contrary to kind of this model focused on kind of caribou, seals, and just fish, probably salmon, we see that it's much more diverse and it's much bigger focus on small game. So we see a lot of mussels, which makes sense. It's a shellman. Salmon, which makes sense. It's at the mouth of a current large salmon run, but some other kind of unexpected species popping up, like ptarmigan. This is a big component of the diet at Difchuk. And looking at our sediment sample, so this is the screen stuff. It was a coordinate screen. Looking at some that are picked out, kind of finely cleaned, we see that saffron cod. So these small fish that can't, big ones get to around 50 centimeters. They're usually around like 30 or 20 centimeters. They are a huge component of the diet. Locally, you might recognize them in Nome as a tomcod. So bigger focus on small game than one would assume. So looking at kind of current kind of harvesting kind of strategies and when these are currently collected, it seems that this kind of faunal pattern is very much a year-round thing where you have species that are representing a little bit of each season, but because of the kind of main focus on ptarmigan, tomcod, and mussels, as well as the fact that this is from a dug-in tunnel house with a coal trap tunnel. It's probably a winter and fall occupation, but the presence of salmon suggests that the Norton are maintaining this year-long presence at these strong salmon runs. I just want to geek out about shellfish a little bit because they're rarely kind of talked about kind of this context. Most of the shellfish that we're getting are blue mussel. So these are species that cling onto substrate. And some other substrate species that are popping up too are things like barnacles, moon snails, and Arctic hyatelas. We're also getting some kind of burrowing, kind of tidal mudflat species as well, such as Venus clams, Arctic surf clams, and talons and cockles. And this is a kind of a project I want to work more on, is exactly how they are harvested. From my knowledge, I couldn't find much information on intertidal shellfish beds. Most of the shellfish harvesting I read about was either in periods of extreme low tide in October or during high storms where mussels are kind of brought to the beach. So I'm very curious exactly if anyone has any information on kind of intertidal mussel beds. I'm very excited to learn more about those in the Norton Sound. Another kind of interesting thing we have from the Norton assemblage is this high proportion of ptarmigan birds. This means that people were in the area in the winter. That's when they're traditionally caught. That's when they probably would have been caught back then as well. But an interesting thing too is that from the artifacts, you wouldn't get this. But what we do have in the artifacts is these netting stones, which were always thought to be associated with salmon fishing. But if any of you have ever kind of made a net from scratch before, you would know that it's a very labor-intensive thing, and it can take up to 2 to 3 weeks to make a whole net. So once you have that net, what are you going to, and the salmon run, what are you going to do with it? So what is done ethnographically and historically, and what we think is going on with Diffchuk is that once people have made these high kind of investment technologies in the off season for salmon runs, they use it on ptarmigan, or maybe they use it on ducks or saffron cod. So really trying to get the most out of their kind of surrounding landscape. Now, it's important to note that the Diffchuk faunal assemblage is very much shaped by it being an estuary system. And it's this rich estuary environment where you have fish running, and it attracts marine mammals and attracts birds. But how does that compare to other sites? So lucky for us, one of the only other sites that has a detailed faunal assemblage from this period is Ayadayat, which is right across the bay. And it's a very different story in the site. So it's occupied at the same time, and we see a lot more small seal being taken to the side. While Diffchuk, it's mostly fish, mussels, and birds. So what's going on here? This is likely reflective of local ecology. So Ayadayat's on a rocky cape. It extends into a ice-free millennia in the winter. So it would have been a great place for sealing in the winter, while Diffchuk would have had access to all these estuary systems. So what's very cool about this, now we can start thinking about the landscape in the Shaktoolik area more as this kind of cultural landscape, and not so much just focused on 1 or 2 sites. So this is some kind of current work that we're working on to kind of better understand the Norton occupation in Norton Sound. And this is kind of where I'll kind of end this first section, is that if you look at the top, this black line, these are population estimates based off of radiocarbonates. If you want to learn more about how archaeologists do this, yeah, please ask me during the question period. But we see kind of this peak around 2,000 years ago, and then another one after 1 AD. And this is actually a common trend between all those big Norton sites. So it seems that something happens, and then the next kind of, we call it late Norton, have smaller kind of settlement size, smaller population densities, less net sinkers, and less ceramics. So in the early Norton, that's when we have our faunal collection, we see this diverse economy, and it's probably diverse as a means to be a buffer against any one resource kind of collapsing. But then something happens where they pivot completely. They are not as dense, they're not using as much net sinkers, and there's less ceramics. So there's something that happens, and this coincides with, if we look at our ice index, with increased sea ice and decreased overall temperatures. So it's very possible that maybe this is representing kind of a reduction in salmon runs. So it forces kind of local populations to kind of pivot completely and maybe abandon these larger settlements. But this is very much still in the work and kind of working theory. So stay tuned on where that goes. So we're going to kind of jump over that gap, and we'll be now talking about the kind of late prehistoric to historic subsistence economies of the Norton Sound. So this is around 1,000 years ago up into the historic period. Back to my my chart here. We're focusing on this like slot right here for these kind of 3 cultures that came afterwards. So most of this data comes from the Shaktoolik airport site, aptly named because it's right next to the Shaktoolik airport. I always joke that it's so great that people in the past have built their site so close to the airport because it makes field work so convenient for us. But it's very much a different story. So opposed to Diffchuk, which is one kind of cultural occupation, this is a palimpsest. So we have like 3 different groups all kind of living in the same area, one after each other. And this is a heat map, and the yellow areas are height, while the blue areas are kind of lower elevation. So we see this concentration on this elevated area right here. And through mapping and dwelling identification, we kind of were able to kind of take this map and isolate for each of our periods. So we see this is the first group, this is the second group, and then this is the historical Inupiaq people moving in. And this is all off the house shape. So not all these places were excavated. Honestly, we only put around could be more than 8 units within this whole site. It's a massive site, and yeah, 8 1 meter by 1 meter test units. So before I start going between the different cultures, I'm just going to talk about kind of the broad, what we're seeing broadly. Of the 31,000 animal bones identified, 20,000 of those were fish. So I've counted a lot of fish bone for my dissertation, and it is a very rich faunal assemblage. So 41 different species. What are we getting? So we're getting kind of your usual suspects. There's a lot of Pacific salmon, but some other anadromous species as well, such as a whitefish, some dolly varden, a little bit of smelt, some freshwater species as well, such as burbot, blackfish, and grayling. And then the next most common fish then is once again back to our saffron cod. We're also getting flounder, which is likely starry flounder, which makes sense because they do like brackish estuary environments. And then we're also getting some strictly marine fish, such as herring and sculpin as well. I'm a big fish head, so this is where I kind of lean my interest in. But we're also got a wide variety of seabirds as well: murres, cormorants, loons, gulls, as well as migratory waterfowl such as swans, geese, ducks, and cranes as well. And ptarmigan are present as well. And then a variety of both terrestrial and marine mammals have been identified from these sites. So walrus, beluga, bearded seal, ring seal, caribou, hare, actually a few different rodents, bear, and fox. So that's kind of the general picture. I'm going to kind of focus in kind of on our kind of different phases. So with the nucleate phase, most of our faunal remains are coming from one area, and it is this midden deposit behind the ceremonial karigi, or men's house. And what we're getting from this men's house is mostly, so this is all the phases. It's a little dense, but just focus on right here. It's mostly salmon. So a lot of salmon. So it seems that salmon was really big at the time, so Pacific salmon, and a little bit of saffron cod and a little bit of flounder. And we look at our fine soil samples, saffron cod. So salmon are usually caught between kind of early spring, late fall, while saffron cod are caught kind of 2 periods. They can either be traditionally were dip netted in the fall when they start moving into brackish waters, or they're caught while jigged off the shore ice in the winter. And in terms of kind of, we have a very small sample of kind of technology, but in terms of the technology that would have been available, that right now what we're mostly getting is piercing technology. So it seems that maybe this was a kind of seasonal camp where fish were mostly kind of speared and not so much netted. So I'm going to pivot a little bit, talk about this other site that was occupied at the same time as the nuclear occupation of the Shaktoolik Airport site. And it is or kind of as was recognized by J.L. Giddings, the Nucleate site. And he excavated in the 1950s. It's a very dense site. However, being in the 1950s, he did not collect any faunal remains, despite identifying a whole fish midden, which is very frustrating. But lucky for us, he left this trench wide open. You could see it from space. And in 2019, Chris, John, and I went to see if we can sample this midden for fishbone. So we just went back to this open trench, and here's the fishbone there, and we just took sediment samples. So I am currently looking at this with an intern of mine who is interested in the macrobotanics, so the seeds in the wood. So there's more to come. But what we're finding so far is a lot of saffron cod bones. So just this is basically just a meter of saffron cod bones. It's a lot of tom cod, but we're also getting a lot of fly pupea, and this makes sense, right? So people are coming on the landscape and depositing all these marine fish. It's going to attract flies, and we are also getting a lot of salmon berry seeds. So we are getting an idea of the plants people are eating. So more to come with this research, but this is kind of what we're getting kind of at this site so far. So with the Nucleate period, we have this interesting kind of like with the Norton period, this interesting use of the landscape of maybe estuaries for salmon, in this case saffron cod, while use of rocky capes for seal, but also saffron cod. And in this case, we're getting a lot of sculpin too from these deposits as well, which are these demersal fish that like kind of rocky areas. So it makes sense. So then the next phase I'm talking about is the Yupik phase. And this is characterized by kind of, seems to be a population boom. We get large dwellings. If you look at these are actually multiple houses that are all connected by tunnels. So huge population boom, and also coincides with increased warfare in the area. And this phase is interesting because we have both a very good time resolution and a very good space as well. And in terms of artifacts, we get a lot of net-related artifacts for this time. So in terms of space, if we look at our kind of faunal deposits this time, we see an interesting pattern where areas on this mound are a lot richer in marine mammals and birds, and have some fish. But then this one unit over here is completely dominated by Pacific salmon. So that's super cool. What's going on there? If you look at the skeletal elements, what we find is that this unit right here is dominated by cranial elements, by the head pieces, while the deposits that are right here, so on this mound, are mostly vertebra and pelvics. So it seems that we have a clear sign of an area where fish are caught and processed, and then another area where they may be consumed in the winter. Cool stuff. So that was kind of playing with space at the site. In terms of time, we have a nice kind of resolution. So we have kind of 3 different deposits for this time. And what we see is that around 1500 AD, diets diversify. So then we see more focused on marine mammals. And then there's this diversification of diet where more fish and birds get brought into the diet. And looking at our sediment samples, what we see specifically with the fish is we see more herring, and also we see more flatfish. What's happening at this time? Well, looking at climate reconstructions done through insect remains from a site south of us in Nucleate, near in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, it is the peak Little Ice Age. So temperatures got cooler. So people have kind of diversified their diets, and it's possibly because of kind of decreased salmon runs. And this is kind of more pictures from the site of Nucleate. And here they have really good evidence of increased warfare there at the time as well. So we have kind of climate change, higher populations, increased warfare. So a lot kind of happening during this time. So before kind of wrap up this section with the entrance of the Nupak people around 1800s, and there's a lot kind of I could talk about this area, but I want to focus on one thing because time is short. Is the entrance into the market economy. In this time, we see more and more European influence. We see the establishment of a fur trading post in St. Michael's. We see trade beads in the area. And what we see in terms of the faunal remains that's very fascinating is that we see a huge increase in fur-bearing animals. And this may be a conscious decision to focus on trade of fur-bearing animals versus caribou hunting. So this is just an abundancy index of fur bearers to caribou. So very fascinating. But so in general, in terms of the fisheries, what we see through time is that there seems to be this focus on 2 main species, a tale of 2 fish, one may say, saffron cod and salmon. So these are kind of interesting species, as both species have little seasonal overlap, so no scheduling conflict. Salmon runs are prone to seasonal collapse, while saffron cod are considered a starvation food and quite reliable and resilient. And it might be the system where you might come for the salmon and stay for the saffron cod. So this is why fine screen sediments are important. And this also might be something that's unique to the Norton Sound, because this is an area that you get northern limits of Pacific salmon runs, but also a lot of saffron cod in the Sound. So I'm going to kind of jump over this. This is kind of a nice little kind of summary of what's happening in terms of with the climate. So we kind of see all these different events happening. It kind of begs the question, how did these past climate events affect past kind of fish communities? So I have probably 7-10 minutes left, so I'm gonna go kind of quick enough. So we know today that
don't worry, Jason, about the time. Everybody's interested in your topic, so don't
cool,
sell us short. Yeah, no worries.
Great. All right, but yeah, I could talk fish all night, so you got to cut me off eventually, because
nobody's going to be here all night.
Okay, so. Cool, great, that's okay. Good to hear. Yeah, so what we see now, this is current data. We see that there is this warming ocean temperatures, and this is both manifested by increased mean ocean temperatures that's resulting in a migration of those more Pacific ocean fish into the Northern Bering Sea, and we also see a dramatic reduction in sea ice. And a kind of along with these things, kind of with reduced sea ice, we see increased coastal erosion, which is a serious problem of Shaktoolik, and we see massive salmon die-offs, which is happening right now. So with kind of these current climate change events happening, something that we want to look at was what are kind of past animal responses. So the current environment in North Bering Sea is one that's very coupled between benthic and pelagic environments, which essentially means that a lot of kind of the ice, a lot of algae bloom that forms in the pelagic zone just kind of falls down into the benthic areas. So there's not a huge kind of pelagic ecosystem in these zones. But what we see with warming temperatures is that there is a shift. And you see this with species like walleye pollock coming in, where there's more pelagic phytoplankton, more zooplankton, and it's kind of changing the energy from being at the bottom to at the top. And given that climate change in the past, can we kind of see these events in the past? So we have kind of two big kind of data sets that we can work with for the Eastern Norton Sound. We have salmon and we have saffron cod. That's kind of the big species that we have from the archaeological deposits. And we know that there are 5 different species of Pacific salmon. However, osteologically, they all look the same. It's very difficult to identify them just from their bones. But we do know that their ranges are changing, and they all have kind of different kind of thermal preferences. So you may not be able to identify them from their bones, but by measuring their vertebra, you can get a rough idea of what species you're dealing with. So we did that for our collections, and we found that there seems to be a mapping on where you do get these shifts in salmon distribution, where in warmer periods, so we have kind of our bottom and top, there seems to be more overlap in species of Pacific salmon, which might translate to kind of more fish availability. While in cooler periods, we have kind of more focus on kind of smaller species. Here, they're only identified as pink or sockeye. It's likely pink. That's the main kind of fish in the Norton Sound. But this is interesting data. And in the future, so what this means is that it's suggesting that in the past, salmon may have adjusted their range in conjunction with changing climates. And future research using kind of more kind of science-based, like using DNA and proteins would be great to kind of validate this data. And this also kind of coincides with some current observations where there seems to be range of expansions of especially Chinook into more Arctic waters. Now, with that said, that doesn't necessarily mean that what's happening currently is normal at all. Climate change happening now is very different than what was happening in the past. This is much more abrupt, much more quicker, and it's very possible that you don't say we're not able to adapt. It was kind of too quick what's happening now. So I'm going to kind of end on some preliminary data that I'm working through with saffron cod. Saffron cod are interesting species. They are demersal nearshore species that feed off of amphibenthic and benthic material and are arthropods, and they are interesting because they are this link in these coupled benthic environments. They're a link between the benthos and the upper kind of pelagic zone. So they eat things on the bottom and then seals and consume them, and that energy goes back to higher trophic species, in this case polar bear, that's what this is a diagram, but humans. So they're very much kind of this anchor to the ecosystem. So I'm going to present some isotope data, and our idea was that we wanted to see if there was any long-term change in their diet, marking this possible shift from past events from benthic to pelagic environments. So I don't have that diachronic data yet. I'm still chewing through it in terms of the carbon and nitrogen, but I have kind of a general plot of kind of, so we plotted, we ran stable isotopes for collagen samples from a bunch of archaeological fauna to see where they fall in. And this was done with the collaboration of Dr. Paul Spock from the Trent University, who looks very intimidating in this photo right here, but is a very nice guy. And what did we find? So if you guys tune in for Nicole Mazzardi's talk, this will be a little kind of familiar. So carbon isotopes tell us about the source of production in the system. So this is kind of plant material. Well, nitrogen is usually trophic level. So at the bottom, we see signatures for our hare and caribou. So that makes sense. They have more depleted carbon. They're very low on the food chain because they have low nitrogen, so that makes sense. So we then have kind of a more freshwater signature that are from our ducks and this whitefish. And then general marine kind of freshwater species are going to have higher nitrogen levels than terrestrial ones because there's just kind of more steps in marine food webs than in terrestrial food webs. And that one point at the top right here, this is a species with a kind of a freshwater carbon signature, but really, really high nitrogen content, and that is burbot, or maybe locally known as lingcod. So the high kind of predatory fish. And then kind of a more freshwater, a higher kind of trophic level signature. We have our flounder. We submitted quite a few flounder. And this is interesting because they also have kind of this freshwater signature for their marine species. And this is kind of explained by them being preferential to brackish waters. And what's really fascinating is this last group up here, which is heavily marine, high trophic level. So these are species that are top of the food chain. And what do we have? Well, we have marine mammals. So these are all kind of pulled together. We have gulls, but we also have, salmon are pelagic, but we also have saffron cod up here. In terms of their nitrogen content and carbon, the archaeological saffron cod are an anomaly. Their nitrogen levels are extremely enriched. To the point that if you just looked at their values, you'd think that they were polar bears or marine mammals. And these aren't like predatory jaws fishes that are going around eating kind of everything. They are very small. So this is likely a product of them. This is kind of the ongoing theories that they're a benthic fish, so they're going to have kind of more enriched nitrogen values just from being kind of in a benthic environment, but also when they spawn in the winter, and that's when they're jigged. Maybe if you go kind of jig for them in Nome during the winter, that's when they're caught. They don't feed. They actually starve. So this high nitrogen content might be a signature of them starving themselves, and that's why it's so high. So there's stay tuned. We have future kind of data looking at kind of long-term change to their diet. It's not straightforward, but it's something kind of I'm working through. And kind of future and current research. So on top of the carbon and nitrogen data we're working with providing kind of archaeological proxies of climate change. So right now we're relying on a lot of kind of big data from either Greenland or diatoms from the Chukchi Sea. So we'll be running actually saffron odorless for oxygen to get localized sea surface temperature recordings to get kind of climate data that is really attached to human occupations. We'll also be kind of investigating change in growth rates from these otoliths. So what's great with otoliths is you don't only get size data, you also get kind of age data from them. So we'll get kind of long-term records of their change. And kind of an overall kind of goal of the Shaktoolik Archaeology Project is attaching regional climatic data sets to changes in settlement patterns and population fluctuations over time. So what does this mean? This means increased surveying of the area to get a better kind of spatial resolution of what sites are there, how dense are they, are people kind of close together, getting radiocarbon dates from those sites, and start building up kind of population reconstructions and integrating these with local and global climatic data sets. That's great. First of all, I want to thank you all for tuning in. I also like to thank the Native Village of Shaktoolik, the Shaktoolik Native Corporation, and all these wonderful and economy people who supported our research in the past. Of course, my collaborators, Chris and John, and all the wonderful interns who worked from the past, and these funding sources as well. So North Pacific Research Board, UC Davis, the Arctic Institute, and last thing I want to say is just go Shaktoolik Wolverines. Right. So please, I'd like to hear feedback, questions, and excited to hear what you guys think.
All right. Well, thank you, Jason. And before we do anything, we always in Straight Science, we're a pretty friendly audience, and be sure to give Jason some love. It's not only not easy to be a straight science speaker, because it's hard sometimes to get up there and have to talk to the screen, and you're not in a room with us all, but also for the audience's sake, he's giving us his presentation tonight in Wisconsin. So he started at 6:30, but for us, but it started at 9:30, so it's like 10:30 at night for Jason, and he's given it his best here. So thank you. So make sure you give a little love to Jason for his presentation. So you do have some comments, and that is there's a lot of thank yous, but also that it was cool. The Yupik had tunnels, and you were mentioning that before we got going as well.
Yeah. Is there any ordering to this, or there's a few questions in chat, and I also see that Justin has his hand up.
Yep. Well, I'm gonna just let you do that. We do have the caller, which I'll go to, and then I do see Justin.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm gonna ask if the caller, because the caller can't raise their hand.
Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, I do have a question, actually.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess, well, Jason, thank you very much for that presentation. Listening to it on the phone, I didn't get to see it, but I really absorbed a lot, and I took some notes. The question that I had over here, and I guess as a zoologist, though, that it would be out of your realm there, was kind of curious about DNA type evidence, the Australasian versus the Eurasian. But if that's not your anything you can answer there, well, the recent findings that they had with footprints down there in the Americas show that it was occupied by humanity as far back as 22,000 years ago. So I was just kind of wondering if this was more something you could answer, what our type of environment would have looked like in the Norton Sound during that time.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So yeah, you're referring to those new footprints in white sands. So I think just kind of getting back to kind of the work in the Shaktoolik area, these populations probably represent more recent migrations. So we're talking maybe around 5,000, 6,000 years ago. But in terms of the white sand footprints around, I think they're dated to like 21,000 years ago. In terms of the Norton Sound area, there's a few other archaeologists on the call, so kind of please correct me if I'm wrong. They would have actually been deglaciated, large parts of Alaska. Not sure exactly what the extent, but there would have been actually kind of this refugia, this ice-free zone, because a lot of North America was covered with ice sheets. So there would have been actually some kind of deglaciated areas, and largely this would have been kind of steppe environment, kind of grassy tundras. In this case, you still would have had megafauna, so very kind of different landscape. And there's a lot of great kind of work being done kind of close to that time period. Some sites dating back 14,000, 16,000 years ago in Alaska. And there's a one kind of potentially very old site in Yukon at Bluefish Cave. I think that's dated to around 23,000 years ago based off of cut marks on bones. It's kind of contentious evidence, but there's definitely people in Alaska 16,000 years ago, and maybe earlier, but I think work is still being done on that.
All right.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Thank you, caller. And are you still at camp or where are you calling in from?
Yeah, I'm out here at camp, and I got all my notes and got my map of Alaska up. I've been listening to this whole thing. It's been fascinating, and wow, 60,000. All right, that's wow.
That's so. Thank you for joining. It's so cool. It's so wild.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to stay out.
And I know it's hard to be a caller, so do just speak up if you don't have any other way to reach us. It's okay. And we do have sort of along the same line, and I know if Justin can hold for a sec, but in the chat box, it says, I've always heard that humans came across the land bridge about 10 to 12,000 years ago. Is that still an accurate estimate? And if so, did they go elsewhere rather than the Seward Peninsula?
The answer to that question is yes, but I think increasingly what we're learning with through genetics and kind of more and more archaeological findings is that there was actually multiple migrations into North America. So definitely does seem that people did cross the land bridge 10,000, 12,000 years ago, but also seems that there may have been kind of population pulses before then as well. There's kind of a big kind of push looking at it would have been kind of through the land bridge, but more skirting it. Like there's this big kind of theory that people would have crossed along the coast of Beringia and kind of sticking kind of these to coastal refugias, exploiting marine resources, kind of working their way down the coast into California, and that's how they may have gotten to white sand. Then there would have been other kind of migrations afterwards. So I think when we're kind of thinking about this area, that it is very close to Siberia, even without that land bridge. So there was going to be, there's multiple human migrations. So there was maybe one 18,000 years ago, then more recent ones, and one at least one 6,000 years ago, another one 1,000 years ago. So people are moving across, and to kind of touch on this kind of this fluidity and kind of how national borders don't really exist. Kind of prehistorically, we at Ayadiyat, so one of the sites we're working at, we got obsidian projectile point, and we were able to source that, and it came from Siberia. So there were trade networks kind of moving in. This is around 4,000 years ago. Yes, that theory is still true, but there's multiple migrations, and it seems that there were even migrations before that.
All right. And as a follow-up to that, is the question was, is there any evidence of how different groups displaced previous inhabitants? Was it a die-off or conflict?
This is such an interesting point. I'm going to speak a little more to once again, it's difficult sometimes to see this in the archaeological record, especially if you're kind of dealing with people who have the same tools, because often what we look at as archaeologists is changes in artifact typology. So it could be something like you have kind of a triangular shaped point, and then maybe you have kind of a more oval shaped point, and that's kind of interpreted as two different populations. But in the case of kind of the same population, it's kind of hard sometimes to kind of see replacement. But in general, in Alaska, it does seem that there are periods of replacement, especially with those kind of the three phases in Norton Sound, Arctic small tool tradition, and the Norton culture, and then these kind of later groups afterwards. We're unsure exactly what the relation was, especially with that transition between the Thule and the Norton. We don't know what happened. Some theories is that the population may have kind of integrated. Some suggest that maybe the Norton kind of disappeared and Thule people came in. And some other theories suggest that current kind of descendants might draw their kind of lineage from these early Norton inhabitants. In the Eastern Arctic, where I kind of cut my teeth on, you kind of see this kind of, it's much more straightforward, where there are kind of groups who came in before, and then the ancestors of the current Inuit seem to have more or less kind of replaced or displaced them. But there's more genetic evidence coming out that's showing that there may have been kind of some contribution to past genes, and I think that's kind of a good place to kind of like talk about it. Is that there has been in the past kind of more of this replacement theory, but now that kind of genetics has become more precise, it's kind of, we're seeing more kind of these traces of past populations in it, and it's not as straightforward as one group replacing the other, in that there seems to be kind of some genetic mixing.
And thank you very much. And we'll take a break from the chat for a minute because Justin's been waiting. And while he's undoing his mute button to ask your questions, perhaps you can stop sharing your last slide so the people watching could see you.
Yes.
Bigger.
There we go.
Okay.
Hello, everybody.
Go ahead, Justin. Thank you for your patience.
All right. Thank you, Jason, for your presentation. It's great to see your work. My question really goes to Dipterhoek. And so you've talked about the net weights for fishing nets, and then you showed an image of what could be a mist net used for a fish net. Do you see more possible evidence of like mist netting versus cast netting for avian species?
Yeah, so yeah, first off, Justin, so excited that you're on the call. So great to hear your voice. Thank you for joining us. And at this point, kind of that net that I showed, the mist net, and kind of all the kind of the other kind of like I think I had like a gill net in there, at least with the Norton period. That's all speculative, right? So like in terms of those net weights, we're not really sure what kind of netting technology they're using or mesh size. So right now, honestly, just from the archaeological standpoint, the assumption that birds are being netted is basically the fact that we have these netting stones that are presumed to be for salmon, but you know we don't know because we have no fibers. But the high frequency of birds is kind of what we're kind of playing off that. At this point, we have no kind of, we don't really know exactly what kind of net they're using. Did that answer the question? Sorry for the kind of like, yeah, we don't know. We don't know if it's cast netting or dip netting or seine netting. Yeah. No,
you answered it perfectly. I kind of wasn't sure if it was like a specific, but you know, yep. It's still research to answer.
Yeah, and there's some data that I haven't shown here where we did size reconstructions of saffron cod. So based off their bones, we did length estimates, and we're hoping to kind of maybe see change in size distribution based off of technology. But what we seem to have been getting is that mostly it's showing kind of an age cohort effect where saffron cod are moving near shore and it's already selecting for a portion of that kind of fish population. So whether you kind of net them or maybe hook and line them, it's kind of still always select that same kind of age cohort.
Any other question, Justin? You were very patient.
Nope, that answers what I'm looking for, and I can always pester him later.
Okay. All right,
yes.
wonderful. So
Please
I was gonna go back to the chat, and I had jumped ahead too quickly, but Katie D from Uniloclete says, thank you, Jason. I'm curious to know if you know of zooarchaeological collections from the Uniloclete area.
Katie, it's like John and I have talked a lot about kind of like how we would get permission to revisit that site and how cool it would be. But kind of like, I feel there's a lot of hoops to jump through to get there. When Lutz excavated it for his dissertation, Bruce Lutz, an archaeologist who worked there in the 70s, he did, from my recollection, note that the presence of, I think, beaver and fish, and he didn't give any specific amounts. It was kind of just noting their presence. So at this point, kind of where things stand, I know there has been some noted, but I don't know exactly kind of the quality of it, how much of it. And like I said, this other site we have at Shaktoolik, we do have fauna at the first bend site, but it's not a lot. But it'd be so cool to get some collections from Nucleate, and also especially kind of for that late Norton phase to see how kind of the subsistence economy changed kind of in this later Norton phase. That'd be wild. But unfortunately, I'm not too clear. I know there's some note of them, but I don't know how much, what quality. Yeah.
That's interesting about the beaver. Actually, there's some people that are looking into beaver's expansion in the Eastern Norton Sound and Arctic, and so they might be interested in the archaeological record for beaver, if there is such a thing.
So we get a beaver, not a beaver explosion, but we get a lot of beaver in with that men's house. In kind of that Thule period, we get actually a good amount of beaver remains that pop up just from this one deposit. So that dates back to 1300 AD. So we do have beaver.
I will try to get you in touch with this gentleman, and you guys can he'll be so excited, I think. So that's awesome. Also, I wanted to note out for the audience in the chat box, if you go to that, Rick Toman has dropped in a map and it just says Beringia. It's got a little funny box around it. You click on that, it takes a little bit to open, at least for my computer, but it did. And I'm glad he threw that in there. It's a map of Beringia and kind of gives you, I think that goes back to that we were talking about people's movements, and you can kind of see like a really nice map of what somebody thought Beringia looked like. And it's exquisite. So thank you for sharing that, Rick. And he says at 18,000 years ago, reconstructed map of 18,000 years ago. And Chris Darwin also noted in the chat, there's an excellent book by Anne Fina, I don't know how to say that, Riordan, The Bow and Arrow Wars, that relates to this question about conflict among Yupik people.
That is thank you for dropping that, Chris. It is a great book and it's a great read. And yeah, it's a fascinating time in Alaskan history. So I recommend everyone to read that book.
And the
Jason,
Katie D. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I just wondered if Jason could speak to the reason why there's actually an absence of a lot of zooarchaeological or faunal remains from archaeological sites that are kind of, excavated more than 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, so unfortunately, yeah, like the heyday in the kind of Norton Sound archaeology was between the 50s and 70s, and that's when a lot of work was done in the area. And there's this kind of just natural processes that will mitigate whether you have kind of bone in your site, and it's like soil drainage and acidity and permafrost or lack of permafrost. But another thing that will determine if you have faunal bones or not is if you collect them. So a lot of these great sites actually had a lot of faunal bones or fish remains noted in the notes, but they weren't collected. And it hurts me when I'm reading a report from like the 70s or 50s where it's like big fish midden found, not collected, or like, sample lost. And it's just this wealth of kind of past ecological data. And yeah, so screening soil is also kind of a new thing in Arctic archaeology, kind of happened recently. So we're kind of playing catch up a little bit here.
All right. There's also thank you very much. And there's a question in the chat box from Jerry. Is there any evidence of the use of sled dogs? Tomcods make great dog food.
Thank you, Jerry. This is something that I didn't include. And this is, so that period with the little ice age and increased conflict in the area also coincides with the expansion of dog traction in the area. And this is something that we need to kind of look into more. We have dog remains from all our cultural periods, and we'd like to do a carbon and nitrogen analysis of their diet, see what they're eating through time. But I suggest, I think that's exactly what's happening, Jerry. And I think this expansion of fishing that's happened around 1500 AD is happening for several reasons, but I think one big reason is to provide fuel for dog traction. All of a sudden, dogs come in, and now you need to feed them. So what are you going to do? Oh, we're going to fish more salmon. We're going to fish more tomcod. We're going to fish more herring. And we need to kind of fuel up our dogs. And if you look at the ethnographic records, so before kind of snow machines came in, like dried and frozen salmon were kind of the main currency because of its importance for feeding dogs. So those who, and I think there's a quote from kind of the historic records of it's like something like, those who have the best nets have the best dogs. So there is this connection between the two, and hopefully we can kind of look at the diets of these prehistoric dogs to see if we see kind of an increase in kind of fish being consumed by them. But yeah, that's kind of something I'd like to touch on. So thank you for reading my mind, Jerry.
All right, and now I know I'm going to just give a shout out to the callers. If there's any questions there, I'll just take a break for that. Feel free to unmute and ask your question now. I know I've got some.
I just wanted to ask the title of that book. And Jason, I owe an apology. I called you a zoologist earlier, and instead of your actual title, the zoo archaeologist. But the name of that book was the war.
It said The Bow and Arrow Wars by Anne.
Bow and Arrow Wars.
Yep, and it's by Anne, A-N-N, Feinup, F-I-E-N-U-P hyphen Riordan, R-I-O-R-D-A-N. The Bow and Arrow Wars.
Yeah, it's very cool, and kind of also speaking to there's not a lot of work done in kind of Western Alaska and archaeologically, and there's still a lot to kind of learn about this period. So yeah, very interesting period of Alaskan prehistory.
All right. Any other questions? One new message just popped in the chat. Oh, Anne worked a lot on the Kuskokwim Delta, so good to know. I think I'll ask my questions if everybody's had their shot. Anybody else?
No.
Okay. So you had mentioned harp seal. Now I'm a sort of.
Oh yeah, I think I may. Wait, sorry. Finish your question.
Is it really harp seal?
No, I think I'm working with some other sites right now. It would have been mostly.
But know that in, because the reason my ear went up is because we do get harp seals that do come across. They have been documented in the literature. They've been documented in Western Alaska. And even to this day, sometimes you can get harp seals, and hooded seals have come across. And so they're coming across the top of Canada. It's a little unusual. They are harvested occasionally, and but it's pretty rare, but it has occurred. And I just wondered, when you were talking about cold and warm and the you know, are we going to see more? Would this have been a time? So anyway, know that I just wanted to check on that because my ears went up when I heard harp seals. But it may actually, you know, there is
no. I think that was
fiction.
That was a fumble. That was a fumble.
Okay, that's fine. I was curious.
Yeah.
And the other thing was, you mentioned that. So I'm trying to get an idea of when it got colder. This is what I picked up. When it got colder, so when you had your little ice age, or there was the people had a less diverse diet. The salmon runs went down.
Yeah.
The salmon were smaller.
Yes.
And then there was less species diversity and more range expansion for the salmon, or the.
No, so the idea is that during cooler periods, especially the Little Ice Age, is that it seems that you have less species diversity in salmon. And in terms of size classes, so these are kind of broad salmon size classes, but it would have been either pink or chum, kind of your smaller kind of species. And that makes, but then it makes sense that it would be pink because pink have kind of this wider Arctic kind of range. And this also coincides with the time of a kind of increased diet breadth. So that's when you kind of see kind of more birds, more herring. Like herring actually come in at this point, kind of specifically as kind
When
of
it's warmer or colder?
Cooler.
Cooler. Okay, so
Yep.
so just as a note, our salmon, the sockeye, are noticeably smaller the last couple of years.
Interesting.
I mean, there's a potentially a prey availability issue or a carrying capacity issue that people are hopefully looking at quickly. And I'm just trying to figure out, because it's so interesting to me that what you're saying when it gets cold, and then that increase in warfare, people are getting stressed out about foods themselves, and we're looking at here. So when it got warmer, what did it look like then? Was it a more diverse diet and larger salmon runs, less warfare? And
so there's kind of like two big kind of warm periods that we we have. So the Norton people, when they first came in with our large populations, that would have been a period that was climatically warmer. Like I mentioned, like they were mostly they had like a diverse diet, but it was honestly not as diverse as it was during the Little Ice Age. So they subsisted on salmon, saffron cod, mussels, ptarmigan, and I think part of their wide diet breadth was also in part in response to large populations. But what was also interesting at this point is that you have kind of no kind of, and I say this in a loving sense, you have no quote unquote trash fish. There's no flounder, no sculpin, and there's no herring as well. So it's the only fish being targeted really seem to be just salmon and saffron cod. And then the other kind of warm period during the MCA, so around 1,000 years ago, it seems to be really just salmon focused.
okay.
And that also goes back to with the kind of historic period with the Nupak people kind of enter. You do kind of get this, it seems to be kind of a return focus on salmon, which also coincides with some warming. But that seems to be what's going on. But I think, it would be nice to kind of add DNA and kind of other kind of metrics to kind of back up the faunal remains.
Yeah, no, that's great. I was just trying to wrap my head around, you were mentioning about change. We're seeing a lot of change in the speed of change. Yeah. But anyway, thank you so much for your presentation. And for the caller who's still on, who's in camp, there is, and it will be in the chat. So I'm just trying to think. This recording will be on YouTube, and you could Google search on YouTube for Strait Science Jason, or his or the Shaktoolik Archaeological Project. There'll be a lot of ways you can get at it. And there's somebody put in, there's a really nice article as well, and they have a link, Chris Darwin, and there's a really nice link right into what you might be looking for regarding that bow and arrow wars book.
Great book.
So look up this recording on YouTube in about a week or so. With that, it looks like people have no one's piping up from the phone, and the chat box has been worked over, and Jim Dory's giving you a clap, so
nice.
That's really good. Thank you, Jim, for that.
Dory.
Oh, and you've got lots of claps coming in.
Oh,
John,
nice.
Also, you got a good Zoom savvy audience, so that's really great. Oh, Rick Toman, do you have a question? I saw you zip up, or maybe you were trying to do a clap.
I was trying to clap and hit the wrong button.
Okay. Thumbs up from everyone. So well done. And I don't know, take tomorrow off. You sleep in or something, because it's got to be pretty late there. And Nathan's giving you some claps, and so all good.
Thank you so much, Nate, for hosting me. And thank you.
I hope we can get you back when you've got more to say. And Dan V, thanking you as well. So next week, next Thursday, I want to give this one a little bit of a lead in. So there is going to be, you'll see this week, there's going to be there's been a national paper that's just come out explaining about a research study that was done out of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute up in the Chukchi. And it seems that we, as the Bering Strait region and the Bering Sea, as our water's gotten warmer, and we kind of live with this low level. Of course, things are about to change maybe, but we have all different kinds of algae. Some algae are toxic. They produce a little biotoxin. Those types of algae are typically very low in our waters. But what they found is we send everything northwards, and there are like a seed stage or cyst stage of these toxic algae that settle out up in the Chukchi Sea. And there's going to be a presentation Thursday night that will be the Straight Science. It'll be Don Anderson, and he will be talking about his research, what he's just found up there, as far as the densities of these little dormant, not good algae resting in the sediment, but they're dormant. They're just asleep because it's cold water. But of course, we're sending warm water nowadays up north. And so this, you may see this in the news. And I want to, I just want to caution that the news is one thing when they make an exciting story, but we will be able to talk to Don Anderson himself. I think it's really important for everyone to tune in on this one. And we will tackle the topic of toxic algae next week at 6:30 on October 14th. So that one, I'm going to give a shout out. We'll try to make sure that goes out to everybody in the region, that invitation. So thank you again, Jason. Don't mean to take away from that. That was awesome. I am learning so much from your archaeological project and really enjoying it. It's fascinating. And my last question is, do you guys have any idea of the number of people that were living in Eastern Norton Sound? It is phenomenal to me when you guys are showing these pictures, the amount of materials, houses, richness of what people were doing and capable of doing.
So yeah, it's hard to get population estimates off of
no census.
No census. No one kind of left kind of like a census binder. And there's kind of a few ways you could do it. We could kind of look at kind of how many dwellings there are, but not only how many dwellings, but how many were occupied at the same time. So what we do is that we take radiocarbon dates of different houses and kind of see when they were occupied. And if you go back to John's talk, something that's like really makes things more complicated at Difjahuk is that some of these houses were reoccupied 6 times or 7 times. So when you look at one depression, it's really 6 houses, like Russian doll style, stacked on one another.
Okay.
But so we don't know how many of those houses were occupied at the same time, but the size, it can easily, from the ethnographic records, can accommodate 10 people. So even like 10% of the site being occupied at the same time, we're talking about 100 people. I see John turned on his video. He might want to.
I was just going to say, if even 10% of the houses were being occupied, say there's 20 houses, you could have upwards of over 200 people right there, if not more. And so that's just a low end estimate. And again, it really looks like people wanted to live at Difjahuk because for like, as I talked about last time, there was this almost consistent early date all the way across the site. And so they're not reusing the pits. They're kind of seeming to be using all the area. But it's very difficult to tell, unfortunately. It's one of those things that we need a time machine to really get those census.
For anyone who's had the privilege of visiting Eastern Norton Sound, you can see why people would want to live there.
And if anyone have the opportunity to visit the site, it is amazing. It's just large. It's like a crater field. It is just a very surreal experience. It's a beautiful site.
All right. Well, thank you, John, too, and Chris. Nice to meet you. And everyone else who came, we'll hopefully see you next Thursday. And thank you, Jason. Hopefully we'll see you all.